Imagine a road with no pavement, no signs, just endless dust beneath camel hooves and stars overhead. Tonight, we set off along the ancient Silk Road, a winding thread that stitched empires together through silk, spice, and silence. From the palaces of China to the bazaars of Byzantium, this path carried more than trade. It carried dreams, stories, and sleepless travelers. So settle in, dear sleepy soul, and let the hush of desert winds and the rustle of silk robes lull you into slumber. Subscribe for more calming journeys through forgotten times, and hit play as we drift slowly through the entire tale of the Silk Road, where history walks gently beside your dreams. When you think of the Silk Road, you might imagine a clear line across a map, like a thread drawn with a stylus from east to west. It did not begin that way. You can start, if you like, by standing with your mind in a narrow corridor of land, pressed between mountains to the south and desert to the north, known to later Chinese geographers as the Hexi, Western Gansu Corridor. Here, before anyone named an overland route for the fabric it made famous, villages traced the availability of water in an otherwise stingy environment. You could walk this narrowing corridor as though you were following a sleepwalker's path, step by step past watchtowers, thornbrush fences, fields of millet and hemp, and small granaries raised on posts to keep rodents out. That is where the Overland Silk Road becomes imaginable, not in a market full of bolts of silk, but in the careful counting of days between wells. The story that Chinese historians later emphasized begins in court and captivity, a contrast that speaks to the fragility beneath imperial confidence. The Western Han dynasty had consolidated power after the chaos of the Qin collapse, and by the time of Emperor Wu, whose reign stretches across many entries in bureaucratic calendars, the northern frontier pressed against the power of the Xiongnu Confederation. At court, the concern was practical: horses, grain, and the stabilizing of borders against raids that carried off livestock and people. Silk was already being woven far to the east, close to the humid edges where mulberry leaves were plentiful and silkworms spun their cocoons in a sequence as predictable as the lunar phases. But what mattered to soldiers and their commanders were hardy horses from beyond the deserts, animals strong enough to carry armored riders and to turn the balance against mounted archers from the steppe. You might picture the court's open airs, halls, a place of ritualized movement where men in robes knelt and rose at rehearsed intervals, their sleeves long, their statements recorded on bamboo slips bound with cord. In that atmosphere, a man named Zhang Qian accepted a mission that would carry him out of the tidy lines of protocol and deep into an uncertain geography. He was sent to find a people known as the Yuezhi, who had been pushed westward by the Xiongnu, with the hope that former enemies might be joined into a useful alliance. If it reads like a simple diplomatic errand, smooth in intention, the ground reality was different. There were no exit gates that let envoys slip unnoticed through the frontier. To leave the Han realm was to pass through places watched by men, whose job was to watch you turn around. The capture came early. This is a dull and stubborn fact. Zhang Qian reached the lands controlled by the Xiongnu and did not pass. He and his companions were seized and kept for years. On cold nights, the captured envoy learned the way anyone learns how to keep warm by tucking hands beneath layers, how to count the passing of seasons by the thinning and thickening of daylight. He married, had a family in captivity, and lived. According to rules he did not choose. In the monotony of the steppe seasons, a man on a long mission could learn more about the structure of power than any carefully phrased report. He would have seen that the Xiongnu Confederation depended on flexible ties of loyalty, shared pasturage, and common enemies. that gifts and tribute mattered as much as pitched battle, and that the economy of herding and raiding had its own reliable rhythms. The famous part of the story is that he eventually escaped. The nearly forgotten part is that the knowledge he carried of roots, languages, and the exchange value of ordinary goods was shaped more by the everyday than by any dramatic scene. If you walk with him in your mind after escape, you move west through a region that historians sometimes compress into a single word, Central Asia. But that is really a beadwork of oases, river valleys, and passes. Think about what it would actually require to cross it. A calculation of how much fodder a pack animal can carry without sacrificing endurance, a knowledge of how leather water bags age in the heat, a routine of rising early to catch the colder hours before noon. A caravan's pace is measured in the quiet arithmetic of hooves, an average perhaps of 30 to 40 kilometers a day in forgiving terrain, much less when the ground is indifferent or hostile. The animals keep the time, Bactrian camels with their 2 humps and rambling patience, mules with their steady intelligence, donkeys with their particular preferences at fords and steeper slopes. Each animal requires a load balanced correctly, not only in weight, but in the way the burden rides, with the animal's gait. You can imagine the packer's practiced eye judging a strap's tension with a touch of the fingers. By the time Zhang Qian reached regions like Fergana, he had gathered tidings, this word fits the era better than intelligence, of horses that sweated blood and ran tirelessly. The blood was likely mythos born from parasitic infections that stained sweat. What matters for the story is that the reputation of these Fergana horses travelled, and the desire for them became a state priority. But Zhang Qian's more valuable report to his emperor was a map shaped from memory and necessity. The location of the Dayuan in Fergana, the presence of the Yuezhi now settled further west, the outlines of Bactria under new rulers, and the fact of markets where silk, though admired, was merely one thread among many. Silk had already moved west in smaller circuits, traded by steppe peoples who could convert a light, valuable fabric into the heavy essentials of their lives. What the Han court received was not an invention of trade, but a better understanding that trade could be organized at scale through a chain of relationships. Before imperial decrees, however, you should linger at an oasis town along the Tarim Basin. You can think of Kucha or Khotan, places that were neither Han nor Xiongnu in their daily routines, but were instead shaped by water and the logic of survival. A day here begins before dawn with the irrigation overseer walking the canals, tapping with a stick along the banks, checking for seepage, and assigning flow shares to fields according to a schedule written in no one's hand, but remembered by those who rely on it. Cotton grows where it can. Fruit trees, apricot, pomegranate, mark family plots. The market opens slowly, with bread stacked under cloth to keep it soft and with a line of buyers at the oil press. Trading here is a layered activity. There are local exchanges in copper coins, counted by sound against a tabletop. There are silver and gold pieces from further west that circulate like improbable visitors. There are promissory notes and verbal agreements that extend credit across weeks and months, a necessity in a world where movement takes time and goods cannot be turned into cash at will. In that market, bolts of silk are not singular wonders. They are units. A bolt has a standard length, and its value is discussed in terms of what it can acquire. A number of horses, depending on grade, a set of armors repaired over winter, a quantity of spices or dried fruits to refresh supplies. A caravan master keeps a tablet of marks in his sleeve, notching sales and returns, planning routes not only by distance, but by the tax structures of the polities he will pass through. Taxes rarely come as a single number. There are transit fees at city gates, warehousing fees if you leave goods longer than a specified period, and sometimes a customary gift expected by an official's household. Each of these small frictions teaches you that the Silk Road's true fabric is not silk. It is bureaucracy, custom, and habit woven into a system that lets strangers trust one another long enough to exchange value. The Han response to Zhang. Chen's reports grew in scale and in gradualism. There were no overnight transformations. Instead, through the Hexi corridor, the state built or refortified garrisons and moved colonist farmers under military supervision to create a ladder of secure points. Watchtowers rose at measured intervals, fewer for dramatic defense than for information relay. In the dry air, smoke by day and fire by night could move news faster than a man on foot, and that mattered for basic things like whether a caravan could expect a gate to be open before sunset. The Protectorate of the Western Regions, an office and a concept, advanced the idea that the court's writ could extend beyond traditional borders by negotiation, subsidy, and presence. This was not an empire of annexation so much as one of agreements and guarantees. The garrisons bought grain locally when possible, but also relied on a state logistics chain. A single bundle of millet sent from a core province might be handled by a dozen men by the time it reached a soldier's bowl in the far west. None of those men thought of themselves as building a famous road, they were just doing their jobs. It is worth following, with your attention, a single bale of silk as it leaves a workshop. The loom sits in a courtyard shaded by hanging grapevines. A woman's hands run the shuttle. A man turns the warp beam with a careful rhythm. When the bolt is measured, tied, and sealed with a small stamp, it passes to a local merchant who already has a list of buyers along the corridor. He does not own the animals that will carry it. Instead, he hires space on a caravan arranged by a middleman who specializes in knowing which routes are passable, which bridges have been washed out in spring flooding, and which officials have been replaced recently. The bale is wrapped in oiled cloth, then in a second covering of coarser fabric to protect against sand. It is recorded in a list that uses both names and weights. If you lean over the scribe's shoulder, you will see characters that denote not the poetry of the era, but its practicalities: quantity, quality, destination. The caravan itself is a moving village. There are animal handlers whose experience shows in the way they walk, slightly forward, as if always adjusting to a living pace. There are cooks who know how to make flavor from minimal ingredients, and who measure success not in taste, but in digestibility and energy. There are translators who speak enough of each language along the route to negotiate fees, correct misunderstandings, and maintain dignity. There is likely a guard contingent, not always soldiers in the formal sense, but men accustomed to carrying bows and sabers, good at reading the harm in a silence. Their pay is not simply money, it is also a share of the goods and a right to prioritize shelter on colder nights. When the caravan stops, the camp arranges itself in habitual patterns, animals tethered with windbreaks where possible, cooking, fires at a safe remove, and the valuables in a cluster with a watch schedule that rotates through the night. As the Han made the corridor safer and more predictably governed, the amount of silk moving west increased, but it never became a flood. Here, scale means something different from modern commerce. A large caravan is measured in dozens of animals, not hundreds. A prosperous year means a few more bolts, a few more horses, a few more foreign coins clinking in a pouch. The difference, though, is cumulative. A reliable passage encourages people to specialize, some in silk, others in horses, others still in copper, iron, jade, or glass. And as specializations deepen, so does the web of dependencies. A smith in a western outpost might begin to use techniques he learned from a traveler from farther west. A weaver in a riverine town might adopt a pattern seen in a garment brought by a merchant from the borderlands. Cultural exchange here is not a burst of inspiration, it is the slow adoption of useful practices. The military dimension remains, steady as a background drumbeat. When the Han campaigned to secure access to the prized Fergana horses, it was not a quest narrative, it was a logistical operation with stockpiles, supply lines, and calculations about how long an animal could remain fit when fed on transported fodder. While chronicles will later mark a victory or a treaty, what the soldiers remember are the details: the taste of brackish water at a particular well, the way boots wear, differently on desert gravel than on packed earth, the inclination of a superior who worries more about stolen grain than visible enemies. Military outposts double as markets on certain days. Traders with animals and goods can sell at regulated times, and in return they receive not just coin but access to information, altered patrol routes, the mood of friendly or unfriendly neighbors, the names of new officials whose preferences can be learned and accommodated. Across this mixed zone of cultures and polities, there is also the shaping force of law, not comprehensive codes in the modern sense, but layered expectations. Many towns maintain rules about disputes that arise between locals and passing traders. If you buy an animal and discover a defect, there is often a customary period during which you can return it, but only if the defect is not one a reasonable buyer should have noticed. If a caravan is robbed outside a town, there are sometimes arrangements by which the town will compensate part of the loss, an incentive to keep the surrounding lands policed. Weights and measures, too, have to be negotiated. You will see balances brought out in markets, their arms worn smooth by handling. Merchants carry their own weights and argue for their scales' honesty. When a town's official standard weight seems to differ, the matter can turn on the prestige of the official enforcing it. Religious life adds another layer of continuity. In the eastern reaches, ancestral rites root families to their dead and organize calendars around offerings rather than commerce. Moving westward, you find Buddhist monks in robe colors that vary slightly by local convention, offering shelter and calm to travelers, sometimes in exchange for donations, sometimes simply as a matter of duty. A monastery near a trade road becomes a kind of storehouse of reliability, a place where tea might be shared, where news can be trusted to be repeated without unnecessary embellishment. Further along, you might encounter fire altars or temples where different rites are kept with equal seriousness, and later still, mosques whose call to prayer orders the day for believers and present travelers with a regular rhythm to match their own. This is not a story of conversion at sword point. It is the practical geography of places that travelers can count on. The quietest influence may be the technology of movement itself. Saddles change shape in small increments that matter to the endurance of a rider. Stirrups, once adopted, alter not only combat but the physical habits of those who ride daily. Harnesses are adapted to the breadth of a camel's chest rather than a horse's, and ropes twist more tightly when made for desert dryness than for the humidity of river valleys. You, watching closely, can see that innovation spreads not by proclamation but by imitation, and the patient argument of utility. If one caravan's animals arrive less sore and more ready for the next day's work, others notice the straps and buckles and knots that made it so. When Zhang Qian finally returned to the Han court after years and a second mission, the emperor received not a tale but a template, an understanding that the lands to the west could be navigated not simply by sending armies, but by involving oneself in the maintenance of routes, the fairness of market days, the rates of tax and toll, the solvency of distant rulers, and the mundane security of wells and watchtowers. In response, the court did what bureaucracies do, issued edicts, appointed officials, set quotas, calculated grain allotments, and adjusted calendars of labor obligation. The result is what later historians point to as the opening of the Silk Road. But if you walk it with your attention on the ground, the opening is less a dramatic unbolting of a gate and more the gradual widening of a well-trod path, the reinforcement of a ford, the establishment of a reliable inn where previously there had been only a patch of ground where someone once slept. So you stand again in the Hexy corridor, a string of settlements tethered to water. The fields look ordinary, the towers unremarkable, the roads dusty. A trader adjusts a strap on a camel's load and checks his tally marks once more. A clerk seals a bale and notes its destination. A soldier on night watch rubs his hands together and counts the hours until dawn. In the morning, the caravan will move west, not to make history, but to keep appointments made by calculation and habit. If the Silk Road begins anywhere, it begins in these repetitive acts, in these silent agreements, that strangers will behave predictably enough to make trust rational. And as the first large caravans begin to move with imperial sanction and protection, you might ask yourself, was it the emperor's will that created the road, or was it the steady insistence of hundreds of unremarkable people turning their own routines into a corridor of exchange that the court merely learned to recognize and tax? If you stand again at the edge of the Hexy corridor and let your eyes move along the line of the earth where scrub and gravel blend into a pale horizon, you will notice that the scene now feels more ordered than it did at the beginning. The road, still a beaten path rather than a paved surface, carries the marks of consistent use. Ruts where wheels have passed, softer dust where hooves have churned the ground. This is not the start of a legend, it is the accumulation of routines. You could say the corridor became a system when a day's march could be predicted not only in distance but in services, a way station with fodder, a guard post with routine, patrols, a tax register kept in the careful characters of a clerk who would prefer to avoid the errors that draw attention. As the Western Han adjusted to the knowledge Zhang Qian returned with, and to the realities of a frontier shaped by a strong confederation in the north, policies shifted toward the measurable. Edicts were written that specified not intentions but allotments, numbers of men to be settled, quotas of grain to be stockpiled, the height at which a watchtower should be constructed so that a signal could be seen by the next tower, even in haze. If you listen to the sound of that administration, it is the quiet scratching of brushes on bamboo slips and the thud of sealed bundles being stacked in storerooms. The tension with the Xiongnu remained the constant pressure behind all this carefulness. You hear it in how patrols count their riders when they return at dusk, and in how herders sleep with a hand on a tether rope. The idea was not to build a wall against pasture. It was to make the corridor expensive to raid and reliable to traverse. Garrisons did not sit idle, they were nodes of exchange. Soldiers bought local grain, which encouraged cultivation beyond subsistence, and in return, local families gained predictable buyers and the sense that staying put near the ditches and canals was safer than drifting away. That is how a military objective translates into agricultural patterns. A field you irrigate to sell to garrisons becomes a field your children will inherit, and a canal that receives periodic attention from soldiers on labor detail becomes a canal that outlasts a generation. In this zone of mutual dependence, the trade in horses becomes more specific. You might imagine the Han officials' continued fixation on the Fergana horses that rumors praised for their endurance and sturdiness. The reality of acquiring them involved expeditions that were more logistical than heroic. Wagons carried barley and millet to feed animals in transit. Farriers inspected hooves with a thoroughness that seems almost ritual. Pick, brush, check for cracks, trim, tar if needed, bind. The officers in charge of remounts counted animals not as symbols, but as assets needing maintenance. Records tracked not only acquisitions but losses: how many horses lame after river crossings, how many lost to disease, how many recovered after rest in a pasture arranged through negotiations with local authorities. When a campaign to secure a treaty or enforce an agreement turned toward conflict, it did not begin with drums and banners in the imagination. It began with confirming whether enough fodder could be transported along a route where wells were spaced irregularly, and whether oxen could pull grain over a stretch of ground that had become unstable after spring rains. At the political level, the Han Court's creation of the Protectorate of the Western Regions was an act of naming as much as governing. To name a protectorate is to decide that a collection of oases and valleys should be treated as a single domain of concern, even though its inhabitants spoke different languages and followed different local leaders. The Protector General's responsibilities were concrete: mediate disputes, ensure that roads remained open, limit the extraction of taxes that would push caravans to detour, and keep an eye on the movements of groups whose allegiances could change with the seasons. Protector General's day was full of dull matters that added up to stability. He might inspect scales used in markets and certify them, record complaints about too many fees being demanded at a particular checkpoint, and arrange escorts for caravans through stretches known to be risky because of bandit activity after a poor harvest. If you want a picture, think of a man who knows the names of minor watercourses and the families responsible for their upkeep, a man who recognizes that the health of a corridor depends on the predictability of small obligations. The Shikiju war in the far west over horses, conducted under imperial pressure to secure the best stock, left its imprint not only on chronicles but on ledgers. Take a moment to look at a warehouse at a staging point before a campaign. Wooden bins labeled for different grains stand in rows. The administrator's assistant carries a tally stick, notched for each bundle issued, matched by marks on the receiving officer's strip. The system is simple because it must be. When groups move across long distances, errors multiply easily, and simplicity becomes a strategy for preventing misplacement and theft. Rations are calculated per person and per day, adjusted for work level, with a note that in colder weather the ration should include more fat if available. These small adjustments kept men steady and cut down on the kinds of petty resentment that corrode discipline. And discipline in this context includes the steady maintenance of the posts that make trade possible: repairing a bridge, clearing a sand-choked ditch, mending a roof where an inn offers basic shelter to those who can pay, and sometimes to those whose need is judged acute by a local headman. These years made the Hexi corridor a living route rather than a mere concept. In Dunhuang, you could hear multiple languages in a market square, none of them surprising to those who had lived long enough to see seasons of better and worse trade. Scribes there, paid modestly and proud of accuracy, maintained documents that mixed matters of state with the everyday. A list might show quantities of silk assigned to ambassadors traveling west for gifts that maintain relationships. Another might record the hiring of local men as porters for a caravan that needed to move quickly through a stretch where animals struggled. Yet another could be a dispute over a boundary marker between two irrigated plots downtown, the kind of quarrel that produces passionate testimony over what looks to outsiders like a straight line in the dust. By tying local life to the predictable flows of state and commercial demand, the corridor cultivated an orderly restlessness, a cycle of movement that villagers adjusted to and in which travelers learned to keep their heads down and their purses close. If you follow one of those travelers, you see how the system fosters professional habits. A caravan accountant develops a way of walking through a market to assess prices. He does not ask first, he listens and watches. How quickly do sellers drop their opening figures? Are there more pack animals than usual tied along the market edge, which might mean recent arrivals and a glut of certain goods? He keeps track, in his own private notation, of which officials favor which kinds of gifts and which terms they use for fees they cannot legally collect, but do anyway. He also keeps a laconic list of which inns offer blankets that have been washed recently enough that they do not smell stale, because sleep is a commodity to be protected on long routes. He can tell you which stretches are bad for sand fleas, and which require extra layers at night, even in months that should be warm. Beyond the static structures, the relay system deserves attention. Messages moved by mounted couriers who exchange tired horses for fresh ones at designated posts. A well-run relay knit the corridor together faster than caravans could travel. That meant that imperial orders regarding tax reductions or warnings about trouble ahead could reach those who needed them before rumors did. Every exchange required 2 people to enact a ceremony so modest it barely registers. A rider swings down, offers a sign identifying his status, a postman checks it against. A list. A fresh animal is brought forward already bridled, and the rider is gone with a splash of hooves through a trough. The system depended on fodder stores, predictable labor, and the quiet pride of the men who kept the numbers straight. You can imagine the satisfaction of a postmaster when a series of relays went off without a delay, and the anxiety when a horse went missing, or a courier arrived late in a season when lateness hinted at more than bad luck. All the while, the presence of the Xiongnu shaped conduct beyond the line of soldiers. A town that wanted to avoid becoming a target learned to keep wealth modestly displayed, to distribute goods so that no single storehouse tempted a raid, and to cultivate relationships with figures in the Confederation who could warn of danger. Noah-like cycles of tribute and counter-tribute formed, greased not only by silk and grain, but by the exchange of wives, hostages, and promises of non-aggression. To judge those arrangements by the standard of sincerity is to miss the point. They were devices for managing risk in an environment where power balanced on animal herds and the capacity to move swiftly. A caravan that planned to pass close to a steppe camp would shift its route a little to the south or north, depending on the mood of the season and what had been heard in an inn 2 stops back. In this way, the map became not just lines and names, but a living memory of how people behaved in various times of stress. Slowly, the patterns of exchange altered what was considered ordinary in places along the corridor. A family that had once woven only for its own use began to weave extra cloth to sell to caravans, adjusting loom width to fit the standard bolts that middlemen preferred. A potter shifted kilns to produce vessels sized to travel better on camelback, thicker at the base to survive vibration. A monk who once saw mostly local faces in a small shrine began to teach a bit more with metaphors that would appeal to travelers who had seen different landscapes. A scribe who copied texts took a care, with language that made them legible beyond his town's boundaries. These are the kinds of changes that slide under the threshold of grand narrative, but they are the ones that hold a root in place after the triumphal entries and official proclamations fade. As the Western Han matured and then faced the costs of maintaining power over long distances, economic measures at the core radiated outward. Monopolies on salt and iron were established and debated, not as ideological points, but as tools for balancing books. That meant officials assessed how many cartloads of salt moved outward along the corridor and whether the prices charged eroded. The incentives for locals to keep producing and selling. The conversation was never just about a commodity, it was about keeping a system of movement affordable enough that it did not collapse under its own fees. In that sense, the Silk Road emerged less like a ribbon and more like a balanced ledger. If one cost rose, another had to be trimmed. If one post demanded more, another had to be satisfied with less. At the edges of Han Reach, in the oasis states of the Tarim Basin, politics moved along its own tracks. These polities were not simply passive waypoints. Their leaders calculated advantage, sometimes siding with Han officials, sometimes with the Xiongnu, sometimes playing one against the other. A protector general's letter might arrive requesting support, and a local ruler might reply with meticulous courtesy while withholding a definitive answer until he knew who would control the next season's passes. In the markets of Kucha or Khotan, that ambivalence translated into small variations in taxes and small adjustments to the hospitality extended to strangers. A trader did not need to read politics in broadsides, he read it in the quality of a welcome, the speed with which a permit was stamped, the sharpness of questions asked about his goods. These micro-signals, understood by those who travelled, were as reliable as any formal treaty. Daily life on the route absorbed these tensions into routines that made sense at the human scale. If a garrison's mood was cautious, a caravan set. Camp earlier clustered its valuables more tightly and doubled its watch. If the mood was relaxed, the same caravan might linger at an oasis, trade gossip as much as goods, and repair minor damage to packs and harness that had been postponed by hard travel. A camp cook might take advantage of a day's rest to render fat and store it for leaner times. A groom might bathe an animal's sore legs with a concoction of herbs learned from someone 2 oases back who swore it prevented swelling. The knowledge that mattered was not held in books but in hands, voices, and the way people remembered what worked the last time a similar problem appeared on the road. In the Eastern Han years, successors to earlier architects of policy extended the logic of guardianship in the West. Generals used a mixture of force and arrangement to keep the strings of oases aligned in a way that allowed passage. The acts that appear as strokes on a map, retaking a town, establishing a post, felt on the ground like the reappearance of patrols on a road where they had been absent for a season, the return of an official whose willingness to accept a certain fee was well known, and the gradual sense that nights were again calmer. Traders do not require peace in the sense of absolute safety. They require a level of predictability that allows probabilities to be calculated. If 1 caravan in 5 will be troubled, but the profits compensate, the route stays alive. If 3 in 5 will be troubled, the route goes quiet, and the market speaks in absences. By the time you have walked this path in your mind enough, you will notice how the corridor produced skills and expectations that lasted longer than any single reign. An ability to judge character at a glance, a discipline about securing straps and knots, an instinct for when to push an animal and when to rest it. These competencies accumulate where people move goods by land under the sky's indifference. A young man who began as a porter might age into a caravan leader whose authority rested not on title but on a history of sound decisions. An official who arrived from the corps with a head full of regulations would, if he survived and prospered, learn which rules to apply and which to ignore for the sake of outcomes that served his superiors' intentions. That is what a system looks like when it has matured. It can teach those within it how to behave in ways that perpetuate it. If the Silk Road now seems more like a mesh than a line, that is because the system you see is not a highway, but a network of places and practices that overlap. You can trace a bolt's path and see how it might switch caravans, pause in a warehouse too long, be lost and replaced by an arrangement to make good later. You can trace a horse's path from pasture to training to sale to service, and you see the people who handle it at each stage, each adding a bit of value and taking a bit of pay. You can trace a rumor's path about unrest to the west and watch how it alters behavior before any official confirmation arrives. The system is sensitive to small changes because small changes shift the balance of risk and reward that keeps it going. In this becoming, this transformation of the corridor into a reliable route, lies a lesson that is not exciting but is deeply human. Stability is not a gift from a conqueror or a decree from a throne. It is the result of many people repeating, what works and adapting when it doesn't, of officials who learn where to bend and traders who learn where to insist, of garrison soldiers who mend canals because that keeps their food supply steady, and of farmers who count on the soldiers to show up when a raid is likely. If the question at the end of the first section was whether an emperor's will or ordinary routines make a road, the answer here leans toward the routines. But as you look westward along the same dust-brown route, you might ask yourself, how long can a system like this hold under the weight of its own success, before the wealth it enables attracts pressures that its routines cannot absorb? When you return to the story's line in the later decades, you find that the habits established in the corridor have settled into something recognizable, a template for reach and return. The Han realm presses outward, then consolidates. Envoys depart with gifts and instructions, and some return with information that feeds more decisions. You might follow the path of those who came after Zhang Qian and see how a mission became a pattern. An envoy setting out learns to carry not only formal letters but negotiable items, silk of different grades, lacquerware, perhaps medicinal substances that can be offered in small portions. He knows to gather intelligence cheaply by listening, to caravan gossip, and to weigh every story against the teller's likely interest. On the road, he becomes less an emissary of power and more a manager of uncertainty, and the reports he sends back mix statements of fact with judgments about reliability. It is a way of governing the unknown by breaking it into names, distances, and lists of what passes for valuable in each place. In the Eastern Han, the efforts to secure the western routes took the familiar form of military expeditions intertwined with negotiation. If you narrow your attention to the scale of a single fort, the life there looks predictable. The watch at dawn, the inspection of weapons mid-morning, the training in lines that seem more suited to open field than to the broken terrain of riverbanks and dunes. Yet those same soldiers become road workers when the season demands it, clearing drifted sand and repairing wooden causeways in saline flats where wheels sink. The records kept at such forts, even if you cannot hold them in your hands, are easy to imagine. They note the arrival of caravans, the registration of goods, the payment of fees that, if you asked a trader, he might call by a term that implies custom rather than law. The act of writing makes the route legible to a center far away, but the act of paying makes the route real to those who live by it. One of the enduring stories from these years is the attempt to reach farther west than memory can comfortably hold. You can picture a messenger standing on a shore that is less an edge than a threshold, told about lands beyond where the sun sinks and about markets where the silk that began under the hands of weavers far to the east is prized, not as the coin of kings, but as one luxury among others. The messenger listens, and the tale extends his world by a careful increment, as practical as a new waterhole added to a map. He sends word back that if a connection to that far land is to be made, it will require not boldness, but patience, permission, at multiple points, arrangements not only for safe passage, but for the exchange of currencies and the interpretation of laws that govern the trade of foreigners. The East does not meet the West in a single handshake. It inches closer by the accumulation of reciprocal tolerances. On the ground, the work of connecting these distances looks ordinary. Relay posts continue to function as the capillaries of administration. Caravan schedules adjust to seasons that the uninitiated might not expect. Autumn crossing of certain passes becomes favored because snow has not yet fallen and summer floods have abated. Farther west, in the oases that sit like punctuation marks along the Tarim Basin, a normal year begins to include a few more strangers at the market and a few more stories that begin with, "I heard from a man who came by the southern route." You can stand in one of those markets and watch as the shock of difference, which might have made an earlier generation pause, is replaced by practiced indifference. The sign that exchange has become an institution rather than an event. A monk. The most important transfers along these roads are not goods but disciplines of mind. From the northwest, ideas about governance and law arrive in forms that are not immediately named but are gradually adopted where they fit the grain of life. From the east, modes of record-keeping and systems of rank travel with officials and scribes who teach by example more than by lecturing. Most quietly of all, beliefs and practices that help people make sense of suffering and impermanence take root in steady ways. A monk in a cave along a cliff face paints not only a figure of contemplation, but a small scene of a caravan stopping by a stream, perhaps because he knows that those who come to see the larger figure also care about the smaller comforts. Time, which erodes empires, leaves such details intact when they are sheltered and repaired by local hands. As the institutions of exchange deepen, they create secondary effects that look at first like byproducts and then, later, like main features. A town that sits at a junction grows in its capacity to host, which means a greater variety of food, more durable fabrics for tents, better tanned leather for harness, and more reliable balances for weighing. The craft of copying texts improves when there is demand for believable records of contracts and inventories, and in the process the copying of religious and philosophical texts benefits too. A smith who perfects a better rivet for pack saddles can turn his attention to other ironwork when trade slackens, which changes what is considered possible in local tool-making. You can see how the corridor begins to manufacture its own necessities instead of importing them, becoming more resilient as it matures. From the perspective of the hand center, all of this registers as names and numbers. Reports arrive. This town acknowledged our envoy that pass remains open. So many horses have been procured, so many bolts have been dispatched as gifts, so many coins collected in fees. Behind those numbers stand the forms of many lives. Consider a single horse purchased in the far west. It is examined by men who have a vocabulary for musculature and movement that is precise and unromantic. It is marked and registered. It is assigned a handler who will learn its aversions, perhaps a reluctance to cross a certain kind of shadow, or a tendency to pull away if a saddle is cinched too quickly. It will serve and then be retired, traded again into a life of lighter work, and eventually be buried outside a town where boys practice with bows. In each phase, it carries the ambitions of distant centers inside a body that simply needs water, fodder, and rest. You might ask what all this costs, and the answer is more than anyone wants to admit. Grain shipped across distance spoils in proportion to time and handling. Guard duty erodes morale in proportion to monotony. Taxes levied for the corridors. Maintenance cause grumbling in core provinces that see little benefit in their daily lives. Factions argue over whether the West distracts from priorities closer to the capital. Yet when officials canvass those who trade and those who farm along the corridor, the answers show a mixture of resignation and gratitude. Resignation, because no system of this kind is free from petty tyrannies and petty thefts. Gratitude, because predictable inconveniences are preferable to unpredictable threats, and because the corridor brings small luxuries within reach, a taste of fruit dried in a way you have not seen before, a piece of cloth in a pattern that seems both foreign and suited to a child's winter coat, a tool that makes a repetitive task a little easier. There are moments, brief ones, when the road feels as if it is held in a single hand. A season of good harvests and calm weather, a set of competent officials in key posts, a year in which caravans move with minimal loss and maximum profit. At such times, ambitions grow. Proposals reach the court suggesting more, always more posts, more embassies, wider claims. But anyone who has walked the route knows that stability has its own limit. A good year invites envy, and envy draws pressure, and pressure reveals where systems have grown stiff. A bandit group that held back now tests the road again. A local ruler raises fees to cover his own needs. An official skims more boldly, sensing that supervision has relaxed. The return to median conditions is not dramatic. It is a settling back into the rhythms that can be sustained without overreach. If you look for a climax in this story, you find only this: a maturity in how people in the region think about distance. Before the system held, distance was a wall. In maturity, distance becomes a cost, something to be calculated rather than feared. That change in mentality allows people to plan beyond their immediate horizon. A family that has always expected to marry within a day's walk now considers a match from a town that can be reached in a week by joining a caravan. A craftsman who has always sold to locals now thinks of making goods not for the neighbors, but for the caravan's mixed clientele. A minor official who expected a career within a single administrative unit now imagines a posting to the far west as a credit to his record. The Silk Road's most enduring product may be this: the habit of treating far places as part of one's own possible life. In time, power at the center shifts, as it always does. New rulers inherit routes they did not create. Some of them understand that what they have inherited will not endure without maintenance. Others prefer near horizons, concluding that the West brings too many entanglements. The road does not vanish when policy tilts inward, it thins. Caravans space themselves further apart. Posts become less well stocked. Markets adjust to lower volumes. People along the corridor, accustomed to variance, tighten their belts and wait for the cycle to turn. In this endurance lies the proof that the route is no longer a project, but a landscape in its own right, one that persists through administrations in the way a river keeps its course, even as towns on its banks rise and fall. The story of Zhang Qian, which began this narrative, finds its resolution not in his returns to court, but in the way his journeys were absorbed into an administrative memory. His reports turned into routines, his impressions turned into places with garrisons and markets, his hardships in captivity turned into a habit of resilience among those who travel and trade. If you want a measure of success, consider this: generations. Later, men and women who never heard his name wake before dawn, bind loads with practiced hands, check straps, count animals, eat, drink, pray, and then set out on the same kinds of paths he traced. They do it without drama because the road has become one of the quiet facts of their lives. So you stand, finally, at a vantage where you can see the corridor as a system of reach and return, of promises kept often enough that strangers can afford to trust, of interventions measured not by proclamations, but by the number of nights a caravan can sleep without being disturbed. And you ask because the question remains for every age: when a route becomes this reliable, does it change the people who use it more than it changes the places it crosses, or do the places, by insisting on their own patterns, slowly reshape the people into new forms of endurance that future roads will inherit? If you set yourself down in the Zarafshan Valley where Samarkand and Bukhara learned to make green from brown, you begin to understand how the Sogdian world turned daily labor into long-distance influence. You stand at the rim of a field in early light while the canal watchman carries a staff marked with notches that correspond to household shares, and you see how the morning's irrigation is not a matter of desire, but of time. Water flows for exactly so long into one plot, then is shunted into the next, the change signaled by a simple shout or a stone set to divert the current. The irrigation schedule has a social life. It is recited, contested, and enforced, and it shapes the rhythm of planting and harvest with more authority than any ruler far away. This is the first thing you learn about Sogdian prosperity. It rests on a web of canals and ditches, on sluice boards and spades, on a mixture of floodwater and underground streams, coaxed to the surface by gently sloping shafts. When you trace this logic into the Turfan depression further east, you see carrés, gently inclined tunnels that catch groundwater, lining the underside of the desert, a quiet architecture that makes oases into machines. In the hush of those tunnels, where air is cool even at midday, you can hear water trickling in a sound that is both mundane and miraculous, and you realize that the Silk Road depends on people who know how to keep that sound steady. Above ground, the Sogdian towns prosper by taking what the water allows and shaping it for exchange. Grapevines clamber up trellises and the grapes become wine in jars sealed with clay and marked with stamps that mean more than decoration. The marks are an inventory system that tells the warehouse head which batch belongs to which merchant, and which can be released on receipt of a certain token. Apricots and melons dry on woven mats, their sugars concentrating into portable sweetness that resists spoilage. Flax becomes linen that keeps its strength in dry air. Wool, sheared in late spring, is washed, carded, spun, and woven with the same mix of patience and muscle that has always turned fibers into fabric. But here, the looms are wide enough to produce pieces that match a caravan's expectations about size, because to sell well, you must think like the buyer you have not yet met. The market square arranges itself into sectors by habit. Potters. Along one edge, metal workers under shade where sparks won't catch. Fruit merchants where breezes are kindest. Each stallholder holds a set of weights, and under the counter there are always a few more reserved for arguments. When you watch a dispute, what you see is not anger but ritual. The official weight is brought out, the scales are reset, a second measure is taken. The seller nods, the buyer nods, and a few copper coins change hands with a sound that has been the same for centuries. You may imagine Sogdian merchants as men on camels, and you would not be wrong, but you would also be missing the ground layer. That makes mobility meaningful. Before a caravan can move, a clerk sits at a long board with a reed pen and scratches out a list. The list includes names and goods, but it also includes something less visible: obligations. A bolt of silk pledged as security against a loan carries its pledge into the dust. A shipment of glass bowls from further west belongs not to the man who carries it but to a consortium, an agreed fiction that binds several investors to one risk. A sack of coins entrusted to a caravan master is documented not only by tally marks on a tablet, but by witnesses who can describe, if asked, what was given and by whom. This is where Sogdian trade begins to look like a system instead of a set of journeys. The Sogdian language fills pages with deft, compact letters, quick to write and firm to read, and merchants who learn to shape those letters can send news and make demands across distances that would otherwise erase memory. You might hold a letter and feel its fibers rough beneath your thumb. You would also feel the pressure of a promise, because networks are nothing without the shared belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday enough for a debt to be paid. The caravan contracts tie oasis to oasis in predictable increments of fatigue. A day's travel for a mixed string of camels, mules and donkeys aims at what the animals can tolerate without losing weight too quickly, because weight lost is profit eaten. The caravan leader's job is part animal doctor, part negotiator, part auditor. He knows that camels will balk at narrow shadows across a path if the angle is just so, and that a mule will drink too much at a cold stream if not watched. He knows which customs official will accept a small present with a smile and which will take offense unless addressed with a particular honorific. He knows to peel back the cover on a bale and check the inner wrapping for chafe, because a frayed edge can lower the quality category and alter the terms of a sale. The caravan cook carries a set of iron pots blackened by years, a seasoning of soot that tells you how many nights have ended with a stew that tasted good enough for men too tired to demand more. The translators speak Sogdian to the core, but they smooth the way with bits of Turkic, with Chinese where needed, with the gestures that override grammar when meaning is urgent. Sogdian presence in the East is never a matter of simple arrival, it is a matter of installation. In Chang'an and Luoyang, Sogdian communities settle into neighborhoods with their own rhythms. They bring fire altars because they carry their rites with them as carefully as any ledger. The title given by Chinese authorities to the Sogdian community leader, Sabao, has the feel of a bureaucratic agreement married to an older habit of choosing a man who can guarantee the behavior of his own. The Sabao keeps lists of arrivals, records disputes, arranges burials that follow the forms of home as far as possible, and ensures that gifts fall into the right hands at New Year, when officials expect to feel the weight of silk in a form that can be discreetly passed on. If you walk with a Sogdian through those streets, you will see the gestures that make foreignness tolerable, a muffled word at a market stall where the butcher knows to prepare meat a certain way, a glance exchanged with a guard who recognizes a familiar face, a woman carrying a bundle wrapped in a cloth pattern that identifies her people even when her words do not. The goods themselves move in patterns that become habits. From the West come glass that catches light in a way difficult to reproduce locally, beads that signal status in small smiles, oils and aromatics that carry the memory of other climates. From the East goes silk not just as a luxury, but as a currency of tribute. Paper that folds one world's records into another's, lacquerware that resists time in a way that people envy. In between, artisans look at the things they did not make and learn to imitate them where it makes sense, altering formulas. For glazes, playing with kiln temperatures, asking travelers how a certain edge was achieved on a certain blade. The Sogdians serve as both traders and translators of technique, because profit requires not only moving objects but also moving knowledge, and they are practiced at creating and preserving trust where there is no sheriff, no single law, only repeated success. At the edges, where Sogdian power is nothing more than their capacity to persuade, you notice their skill in making systems of credit that feed rather than starve movement. An agent in Kashgar might advance goods to a caravan leader with the understanding that repayment will be made in Chang'an, where prices are higher. Another agent in Turfan might underwrite a portion of the journey's costs in exchange for a share of profits, the proportion calculated according to distance and risk. These arrangements rely on letters carried by others, on seals that can be recognized even when stamped in haste and in dust, and on a web of reputation that punishes default without violence. The penalty for failing to honor a note is not jail. It is exclusion, the closing of doors at inns where consensus prevails, the cold shoulder at markets where prices are decided as much by familiarity as by supply. The oasis cities themselves are not passive scenery. They act like managers of traffic. Turfan posts notices of market days and enforces a serial order in which caravans of different origins unload to prevent chaos. Khotan, richer in timber and known for stones lifted from riverbeds that can be polished into ornaments, augments its wells and insists that caravans accept a schedule for drawing water because one man's hurry is another's thirst. Kashgar, at the hinge where routes split north and south of the Taklamakan, cultivates brokers who specialize in redirecting loads. Silk bales can be divided and sent in halves on alternate routes to hedge against weather and rumor. These are not dramatic decisions. They are calculated routines that turn unpredictability into routines of probability. You will find Sogdian scribes in places where they are not the rulers, but where their pens matter to rulers anyway. A Turkic chieftain hires a Sogdian to keep accounts because his merchants trust those numbers. A Chinese official asks a Sogdian interpreter to sit in on a negotiation because the interpreter can dress a price in terms that sound right in two languages at once. In the southern route along the Tarim Basin, a Buddhist monastery maintains guest cells for traveling traders. The ledger that notes who stayed and how much they donated might be written in Sogdian because the majority of guests read it best. The language becomes a layer in the road's surface, a kind of paving that remains even when powers shift. When you look at Sogdian art, murals from houses in towns like Panjikent, you see banquets with platters and textiles rendered with a care that suggests familiarity with plenty, and you think about the social world behind those scenes. To feed guests with fattened lamb and sweet wine is to claim your place in a network where generosity is remembered. The musicians hold lutes and harps in the scenes, and you hear, beneath the image, the regular beat that keeps dancers moving, in circles. Songs travel easily, and so do recipes. Ways of preparing lamb with herbs learned in a monastery kitchen far to the east find their way back along the routes to a merchant's household in the west. And a child learns to expect a particular spice with a particular dish at a particular festival. In these small consistencies, identity survives the long road. The taxes that touch the caravan string are not simply predations, they are part of a negotiation in which rulers turn the promise of security into revenue. A levy at a city gate might be fixed for a season and then revised if a neighbouring power causes trouble, the amendment posted in a square in script that a Sogdian clerk can read quickly and translate into costs that he will spread among investors. A transit pass is stamped not only with a seal, but with the date of issue, which matters because passes expire to prevent them turning into fake blankets of immunity. The caravan leader's belt pouch holds not only coins but passes, notes of intro, and a string of small tokens from shrines where he left offerings in hopes of fair weather. A good leader knows the order in which to present documents so that an official's ego is stroked before his suspicions are awakened. News moves with caravans as steadily as goods. A rumor that prices for raw silk have fallen in one market turns loads in another. A story about bandits 2 stops ahead changes a night's camp into an early retreat. Sogdian merchants become brokers of information in the same way they broker goods. They learn to trust certain voices, to discount others, and to keep their own counsel until a price is struck. Letters carried from relatives in distant cities contain not only greetings but advice about which officials will be receptive to certain gifts, about which quarters are safe to lodge in, about where not to display wealth. The letters also carry sorrow, news that a cousin died of fever in a winter camp, that a debtor failed and then vanished, that a child's naming ceremony went ahead without the traveller who had hoped to attend. Travel binds and separates at once, and the Sogdians learn to live with that tension as the price of their chosen prosperity. By late afternoon the market cools and the work of counting begins. The Sogdian merchant sits with a tally board and a scrap covered with figures that only he finds obvious, and he reconciles what has come in and what has gone out. He stores coins not in a single bag, but in several, distributed within bedding and beneath spare clothes, because a thief who finds one bag is less dangerous than a thief who finds everything. He checks the condition of a valuable bowl bought earlier, lifting it to the light to see if hairline cracks have widened. He smells a bundle of spices to judge whether exposure to heat has dulled them. He takes a moment to clean the nib of his pen and to smooth the rough surface of a sheet that will bear tomorrow's entries. And as he does this, he listens to a singer outside who has begun a slow song that travelers favor at day's end, a tune that makes you think of planes and stars, and of the way the road offers comfort and risk in equal measures. If you step back and try to see what binds all this together, you find that it is not drama but habit. Water flowing on schedule, letters written and delivered, weights agreed upon with muttered oaths, taxes paid with a grimace and a shrug, children taught to recognize seals and scripts they cannot yet read. The Sogdian thread is strong because it is spun from the fibers of many ordinary days, and because it ties places together without trying to rule them, only to make them useful to one another. And as you watch a caravan set out from Samarkand as evening cools the air, you might ask yourself, when so much depends on trust that is never formalized beyond ink and memory, how many failures can a network absorb before the thread frays? And what quiet repairs do people make to keep a way of life from unraveling? If you resume the path with the morning sun angling shallow across the dust, you find the Sogdian presence multiplied and diffused along the great eastern capitals. The quarter where Sogdians lodge is busy at a domestic scale long before market. Stalls open. A woman judges the heat of an oven by the color of its mouth and slides in flat rounds of bread whose bubbled surfaces tell her where the dough rested too long. A boy carries a jar of clarified butter to a neighbor who needs it for a ritual that will end by noon. A man whose job is to keep the accounts of a distant cousin sits in a courtyard and copies yesterday's figures into a book reserved for tallies that may someday become evidence. The sabao of the quarter makes his rounds slowly, not because he is lazy, but because part of his work is being seen. He notes which house has a broken gutter that will flood a neighbor's entryway in the next storm, which house added a room without asking permission, which doorframe shows a mark that signals mourning. The sabao carries a seal in a pouch wrapped in a piece of cloth that only he touches, and when he presses it into clay, the impression says more than a name. It says that this person belongs to an arrangement. In the heart of the city, a market inspector walks a path that takes him past stalls where the Sogdians stand confident in their prices because they know the cost at which they bought, the cost at which they can afford to sell, and the cost at which it is wiser to carry a good further along. When the inspector asks to see a weight, a Sogdian seller hands over his standard without anxiety, because on good days the standards align. On other days, there are arguments in soft tones that blow past like breezes. Behind the stalls, in cramped rooms where the smell of spices arranges itself in layers, clerks tally in a mixture of scripts because translation on paper can make translation in the mind less costly. A clerk writes the same figure twice, once in Sogdian, once in the local script, and by doubling he aims to halve the risk of confusion later, when tired eyes might misread a curve or a stroke. Monasteries in the oasis world have learned the economics of welcome. A monastery with good guest cells and a reputation for fairness becomes a trusted waypoint, and trust yields donations that repair roofs and keep lamps burning. The guest book at such a place records occupations as well, as names: caravan leader, groom, camel owner, cook, translator, guard, scholar. Each entry has a neat column for a donation made, another for a donation promised when the traveller returns by the same road. Experienced abbots know how to set expectations so that a traveller leaves feeling bound by gratitude rather than resentment. The stable attached to the monastery is managed by a man whose knowledge of animals can be read in how he handles a skittish foal or a mule with a sour ear. He keeps separate racks for tack from different regions because he knows that leather cut for one style of animal will sit poorly on another. When he loans a saddle, he notes the borrower and the condition of the leather down to which straps were newly repaired, so that when the saddle returns, he can judge whether the borrower treated it well. The Sogdian credit system grows more articulate. Here, under the pressure of distance and opportunity, an agent in the eastern capital can extend credit to a traveler from the Zarafshan Valley because both belong to a network regulated as much by reputation as by calculation. The terms of a note might specify repayment not in coin but in kind, adjusting for the seasonal value of silk versus the relatively steadier value of grain. A clever creditor writes clauses that account for snow in the passes or for the sickness of animals. In the margin, he notes what would constitute proof of misfortune sufficient to delay payment without triggering penalties. Such clauses read, "Like the biography of a road, they tell you what goes wrong often enough to plan for." They also tell you how failure is sorted into categories, blameworthy and blameless, and how communities calibrate mercy to keep commerce alive. Sogdian ritual life adjusts to exile without surrendering its anchors. Fire lit in a foreign city still warms the hands of those who arrange the rites, and in the smoke you see continuity that does not require cultural power to maintain itself. A funeral for a merchant who died of fever does not bring officials, it brings compatriots who know the prayers, and a neighborhood who knows the etiquette of attendance. The rites are not only about the dead, they are about teaching the living how the community will behave the next time sorrow arrives. After the funeral meal, the ledger comes out because even grief is accounted for. Who contributed to the expenses, who visited, who sent condolences in the form of goods that could be easily turned into coin. The Sabao keeps that list not to shame those who gave little, but to remember who needs help the next time trouble comes. The workshops in which Sogdian artisans adapt to local tastes and technologies are places where you see ideas moving through hands. A glassworker examines a piece from far lands, trying to imitate its clarity with sand and ash available nearby. He knows the shape of his furnace's heat and the stubbornness of impurities. A textile workshop tries patterns learned from customers who admire something seen in a stranger's robe, and the weave tightens or loosens according to what the loom tolerates. A papermaker experiments with fibers that suit the climate, learning that humidity alters drying times and therefore strength. These small experiments become local traditions when repeated, and in repeating, Sogdians stop being foreigners who bought and sold and become neighbors who make and mend. The road's economy becomes less about moving things that cannot be made locally and more about moving styles and standards that make local goods more desirable. Beneath the visible fabric of trade, the mathematics of trust continue to grow. A Sogdian investor back in Samarkand may have stakes in 3 caravans at once, none of which he will see, and his prosperity rests on the probability that 2 will succeed and the 3rd will at least break even. The letters he receives from his partners are full of numbers, but not only of numbers. They contain judgments that are the product of long practice. A certain route this season seems unfriendly to strangers. A particular town has raised fees but compensates with better night watch. A garrison commander is new and insists on a rule that the previous commander allowed to be flexible. The investor marks these notes with small signs and files them in a chest whose drawers tell a topography of risk more accurately than any map. If you open that chest, you can smell ink, leather, dust, and a little oil from the lamp he uses when tallying at night, long after the courtyard has gone quiet. The street life of the Sogdian quarter includes the minor institutions that make community real. A pawnbroker's shop lends against a ring or a tool and records the transaction with enough specificity to deter substitution. A bathhouse admits travelers and locals alike, and the attendant remembers faces and the stories attached to them in a way that makes him a nodal point in the flow of information. A tea stall sells a bitter brew that keeps eyelids from sagging, and it becomes the place where small disputes are aired without escalating. The tea seller hears about a guard who has become too meddlesome, about a magistrate whose clerk insists on a new fee that has no basis in precedent, about a caravan that arrived missing a man who drifted off at night and did not wake. Here, gossip becomes an asset, sifted and sold without coin, a currency that anyone can mint, but not everyone can spend well. The wider politics always press, even if softly. A changing governor shifts the tone of everything without rewriting. A single rule. The governor's household might favor certain donors, and Sogdian merchants adjust accordingly, not to flatter power, but to keep the stream flowing. An envoy from the steppe pays a visit and talks of horses. Markets respond by putting more emphasis on saddlery and less on ornaments. A tax debate in the capital many days away trickles down as a recalibration of tolls collected at the city gate, and the first people to understand the change are those who stand at the gate every day and can hear the tone in the collector's voice. Sogdian merchants are rarely the heroes or villains of these adjustments. They are the ones who convert them into lived practice, altering routes by a day or a week, investing in one good rather than another, advising younger men to wait or to hurry. Even the rituals of rest and repair encode knowledge. A caravan at ease in a monastery's yard is a picture of order. Tack hung where wind will not deposit grit in buckles, blankets shaken and folded, animals inspected for sores at the corners of the mouth where bits sit. The cook makes a porridge, with extra fat when mornings are cold, because worn-out men lose heat faster. The leader allows an extra hour of sleep if crossing a high pass is next, because fatigue accumulates like debt and demands interest if not managed. A man sits apart and fixes the stitching on a shoe, and someone nearby will ask to borrow an awl, and in the lending you see the microeconomics of thrift. The copyist who carries the caravan's papers uses the evening to sharpen his reeds and to smooth a sheet of paper over the flat of his forearm. He spends 30 breaths on preparation and then writes 6 lines slowly, because speed on the road is the enemy of clarity on the page. Some of the most delicate work the Sogdians do is intermediation when mistrust has hardened into refusal. A Chinese buyer distrusts a Turkic seller's measure. The Sogdian stands between them and translates not only words but intentions, vouching with his name and his future business. An oasis ruler wants gifts without calling them taxes. The Sogdian arranges the presentation in a way that satisfies pride and keeps costs within margins. A monk wants funding for repairs. The Sogdian merchant offers to pay half now and half later, the second half contingent on receipts kept with a care that honors both the monastery's sanctity and the merchant's insistence on accountability. This middle work is neither celebrated nor remembered in triumphs, but it is the glue that keeps a road from falling apart into ordered islands of suspicion. At night, when the quarter quiets, you hear a different economy at work, the economy of memory. Someone tells a child the story of a forebear who travelled farther than seemed wise and returned with a scarf in a colour no one had seen. Someone else points to a carved stone and says that this stone came from a place where the river turns sharply. The stone is proof that the person telling the story was there. Someone recites a short prayer for safe passage, and the words are the same as those said generations earlier, because even as the world changes, the prayer's usefulness stays the same. The road is not only an external arrangement, it is an internal habit, a way of thinking that trains you to weigh, to measure, to defer gratification, to trust cautiously, to keep your lists and your promises in the same place. So when you consider the Sogdian diaspora at its most articulate, offices in foreign cities, ledgers in 2 scripts, rites adapted under the eyes of strangers, canals and curres maintained with precision, you see a people whose talent for turning ordinary work into extraordinary reach allowed them to stitch together places that only partly understood one another. And yet, as seasons accumulate and new powers appear, you have to ask, what happens when the habits that sustain this network meet new religious demands, new sovereignties, and new avenues of movement that bypass old arrangements? Can the mathematics of trust be recalculated fast enough to preserve the thread without snapping it? When you look west from Samarkand after seasons of stability, you see horizons that have learned new words for belonging. The rise of Islam across the Iranian plateau and into Transoxiana does not instantly erase Sogdian practices, but it surrounds them with fresh obligations and opportunities. The markets hum as before, yet a new vocabulary begins to shape contracts, invocations and formulas that reflect the ethical and legal sensibilities of a faith centered on fairness and prohibition. Against certain kinds of usury, Sogdian merchants, practiced in adjustment, learn which deals offend new norms and which can be reframed without altering substance. The shift is not a rupture, but a graft. Muslim rulers need trade as much as any ruler on arid ground, and Sogdianer experience in keeping ledgers straight and caravans moving becomes valuable to courts that want revenue without chaos. The seal that once marked a Sabau's authority continues to impress Clay, but alongside it appears a new title that makes sense to the new administration, and men who used to answer to one set of overseers learn to present themselves convincingly to another. Religious change travels with the road's usual mixture of curiosity and caution. Fire temples coexist with new places of prayer for a while. Funerary customs layer old gestures under new words. A merchant who washes before prayer washes also before counting, because in the mind, habits couple in ways that feel natural. The monasteries adapt too. Buddhist communities that had offered beds and tea adjust their registers to note donors by new names and add columns for offerings that now carry different expectations. Nothing essential to travel changes. Lamps still need oil, roofs still need repair, and travelers still need rest. But you sense that the ideological winds have shifted. Sermons talk of a different ideal life, and even if you do not enter the spaces of worship, you notice how the city's sounds align to a new rhythm of time. Political masters change with similar subtlety and occasional violence. Turkic polities set their standards on city gates. Arab commanders ride in with rules that at first seem severe and then prove predictable. The Hephthalites, the Western Turks, the early Islamic governors, each leaves an imprint measured in the fees collected and the roads policed, in the measure of grain set aside for sale to caravans, in the reliability of justice when local men bring a quarrel over a contract to an official. Sogdian merchants adjust their networks to these changes, not by abandoning the old, but by layering the new atop it. A man who sent letters in one language now writes in two, and his son will write in three. A woman who used to attend to the goods in a courtyard while her husband handled external affairs begins to learn the new formulas that buyers expect to hear, because she sees that speaking correctly can be as profitable as weaving tightly. In the eastern reaches, the Sogdian communities continue to live under larger powers that fluctuate between welcome and suspicion. Tang administrations find Sogdian expertise in trade management useful. They also sometimes come to suspect foreign communities in times of stress. When troops need horses, Sogdian dealers are the ones who know who has them and at what price. When rebellions sour the capital's mood, Sogdian neighborhoods find it wise to appear small and quiet. The Sabau's job grows subtly harder, balancing the need to present successful commerce to authorities with the equally strong need to avoid being seen as too successful. The books he keeps in his room now include pages that have nothing to do with goods and everything to do with risk, notes on which officials are under pressure, which festivals make soldiers more or less likely to interfere, which curfews are enforced, and which are neglected. Out in the oasis towns you see continuity in the water first. The canals still run when cleaned, the carrés still deliver when cleared. A new ruler appoints a new overseer, but the work is the same. Men with baskets climb down shafts and shovel silt into the light. They speak of politics only in brief, because under the ground you worry about air, not edicts. Above ground, dates still dry, sheep still graze, and stalls still open when the sun warms the stones. What changes are the stamps and the terms under which sellers meet buyers. The coins in a pouch change faces, the measures for tax change names, the signatures at the bottom of a list belong to other men. The patterns of trust, however, persist. A merchant known to be fair yesterday is fair today. A caravan leader who kept his word then keeps it now. The road absorbs power as much as power tries to absorb the road. If you trace the Sogdian thread through the next generations, you see it thinning not because it breaks, but because it merges. Persian becomes a language of refinement and record in the region, and Sogdian words filter into it. Scripts shift as administrators adopt forms that suit the new states. Many Sogdians convert to Islam, and with conversion, their names change, their rituals change, and their sense of belonging evolves. Yet their knowledge of trade, of water, of weights and measures, of what a caravan requires on day 3 after a difficult crossing, does not vanish with a change of prayer. The knowledge becomes a skill set that loses its label. It is simply what competent people do in a place organized by scarcity and distance. You could call this decline, or you could also call it success, because the know-how has been naturalized into a wider world. Eastward, the Sogdian script leaves a visible legacy in the alphabets used by peoples who found its shapes suitable for their languages. Administrative habits that Sogdian scribes carried, dating in particular styles, recording witnesses in particular orders, embed themselves in the document traditions of courts that have no memory of the men who first taught them. Musical forms, too, survive in ways that cannot be footnoted. A rhythm in a dance in a town at the edge of the desert echoes patterns you saw in house murals far away. A taste for certain sweets, a preference for cloth dyed a certain way, a style of jug with a lip shaped for easy pouring. These are trivial until you think of how long they persist and how often they cross thresholds without needing to be named. The road itself shifts emphasis as seaborne trade becomes more attractive in certain seasons for certain goods. Ports to the south promise bulk movement for things that the land finds heavy. Spices, sugar, timber, these ride ships well, and the cost per weight drops below the tolerances of a camel string. Yet the oases do not empty. Silk, horses, precious items that have high value in small volume. Information that prefers the speed of land relays. These continue to justify caravans. The Sogdian way of thinking, impressed on the roots by centuries of competence, remains the standard for how to travel well, even when the names of the travelers' gods have changed, and the passports say different things. Trade credit practices that you could recognize across generations persist with new words. A letter of guarantee written by one merchant to another travels to a city where the two have never met, but where each knows the other's reputation by the testimony of third parties. A debt is repaid in the form of goods delivered to a partner. In a different town, an exchange that requires 3 separate sets of records to reconcile. The men who do this well become known not for their faith but for their fairness, and they are allowed to prosper, not because rulers love them, but because rulers love revenues and hate chaos. The skill of turning offers into contracts that everyone can live with remains the road's core competence. The family stories change, become less concerned with who kept a flame alive, and more with who memorized a verse perfectly or who made a good bargain at a distant fair. But the things kept in chests do not change much. You still find seals wrapped in cloth. You still find account books tied with cord. You still find lists of obligations in a hand that has learned to write clearly at speed. The chests smell the same: leather, dust, ink, a hint of spice. You could open one in a new century and feel at home if you had learned the old ways. Time makes old names strange, but it keeps the tools familiar. In the end, when you stand again by a canal at dawn and listen to water being persuaded into a field, you realize that the Sogdian thread was never only about silk or even about trade. In the narrow sense, it was a way of arranging life so that effort flowed where it could do most good over time, a discipline of adjusting quickly without being blown off course by every gust. The thread, seen properly, is a habit of thinking that treats distance as a cost to be borne together, not as a wall. And as you watch a new caravan tie down its loads under a sky that has seen many creeds and rulers come and go, you might ask, when a people's knowledge dissolves into the common sense of a region, does their story end, or does it become the quiet strength through which other stories learn to carry themselves without knowing who showed them how? If you approach the road again under the Mongol sky, you learn first to see permission. A small plaque of metal, thin, engraved, worn along its edges, hangs on a leather thong and rests against the chest of a rider who pauses at a post to drink. It is a paisa, a tablet of authority, and it converts distance into compliance. When the rider presents it, the postmaster does not think about the person. He looks at the symbol that obliges him to release a fresh horse, to provide fodder, to offer a place to sleep, to send the rider onward with the same urgency with which he arrived. The relay system, the yam, is a net of posts held together by fodder bins, and the habit of answering signals quickly. You may be tempted to imagine speed as a thrill, but the yam is a bureaucracy of hoofbeats, a choreography of changes that work only when everyone involved tampers down his impatience into routine. A courier rides in, the postmaster checks the paisa against a mental catalogue of classes, a fresh horse is led forward, a mouthful of dried meat is chewed into softness while a strap is tightened, and the rider is gone with a reassurance that the road ahead has been readied for him by others who also know their part. Under this system, a caravan leader who once worried about being delayed by petty officials now worries about not having the correct permissions to enjoy the system's safety. The Mongol realm is an archipelago of orders, and the paisa is the island pass. Caravans that carry goods for the court, or that have invested in the right connections, receive essays of safe conduct and instructions about where to stop. Those that do not must arrange protection or accept the standard risks of the road. Even risk is measured now. Banditry declines at least along the main routes because the consequences of being caught are severe and uniformly applied. You, traveling under this regime, carry your documents in a pouch that you touch more often than you realize. You also learn to speak in the language of credentials, where you have been authorized, by whom, for how long, with how many animals, carrying what loads. The world narrows into lists, not because lists are beautiful, but because lists can be read by strangers with authority over you. The posts themselves are dull places full of important things. Fodder is cut and stacked with discipline because moisture is the enemy and mold kills horses faster than cold does. Water skins are hung with care to keep their seams from drying and cracking in wind. A ledger on a shelf records what leaves and what returns, horses counted by height and color, saddles marked for minor repairs, blankets with a tally of patches. A smith taps rivets back into place on stirrups whose edges catch and chafe. He knows that a small discomfort at mile 50 becomes a wound at mile 100. The postmaster keeps a chest with spare straps, nails, pins, and ointments for sores, because a working post is a hospital for equipment and the animals that wear it. He is not impressed by the riders he sends out. He is impressed by how many days the posts under his care have operated without failure. He knows the number as quickly as he knows the day of the month. On the broader stage, the Mongol insistence on intelligence makes travelers into informants, whether they want to be or not. A caravan master arriving at a town finds a minor official who asks questions in the polite tone that says it is better to answer fully. How many days did you take from the last post? What news of prices? What weather did you encounter on the northern route? What did you hear about the mood in the market at a city a week behind you? Answers are recorded, roughly, but with enough care to be useful, and the pattern of many such conversations maps a terrain of rumor that matters to those who govern. This is not surveillance in the modern sense, but it is systematic curiosity, and the result is a center that knows more about the arteries of its body than most centers ever do. Caravans under Mongol protection do not grow infinite. They grow regular. A string of 30 camels with additional mules and horses flows through a landscape where inns and caravanserai have been placed at intervals that reflect the endurance of animals and the hazards of terrain. The caravanserai are walled because a wall that resists only laziness is still useful. Inside, rooms line a courtyard where animals kneel and men unbind loads with the practiced silence of tired colleagues. Each room has a niche for a lamp, a spot to hang a cloak, a ledge for a bowl, and a roll of bedding. There are stables with troughs. There is an overseer's office where weights sit in a row and a scale hangs from a beam. On that office's wall, you find written the fees for standard services, posted to reduce haggling into a performance rather than a contest. The overseer knows the court expects this predictability. He knows, too, that small favors oil the hinges of order, and he dispenses them in moderation to travelers who seem both familiar and fair. Merchants learn the rules of the new order as a set of permissions and prohibitions. Carrying weapons into certain zones is allowed if declared. Failing to declare them turns lawful traders into people with a problem. Buying fodder directly from a village near a post is discouraged so that posts retain their strength. Buying fruit and bread is tolerated because a man who eats well tonight is a man who will travel tomorrow without causing trouble. Paper money may be demanded in some parts of the empire, coins in others. The savvy caravan carries a mixture and holds in reserve items that can be converted into either at decent rates, tea in compressed bricks, silk in narrow bolts, preserved food with long shelf lives. Accounts are kept in a way that translates across such boundaries, with lines on the page drawn to separate currencies and with a notation in the margin describing what was sacrificed to make exchange tolerable. The famous travelers you might name become ordinary under this system if you bend close enough to see what they did each day, because even a famous merchant or envoy stands in line at a post and accepts a horse from a man whose name he does not learn. If a traveler has a story to tell later, the story's bones are made of the routine: a post where the fodder was wet and caused worry, a guard whose thoroughness was admirable to those who like stability and unbearable to those who like speed, a sparrowhawk seen spiraling against a white sky and then gone, leaving the mind a shade lighter. Even the great crossings, rivers with braided channels, passes where cloud shadows sprint across scree, become ordinary when factored into the table of expected times between posts. The partnership arrangements that the Mongol world encourages between ruling figures and merchants formalize something the road has long known: that risk is best borne by those who can move more freely than armies can. A noble invests in a caravan by writing a letter that grants access to posts and protection along certain stretches. In return, he expects a portion of profits on goods he did not have to carry or store. The merchant gains the right to call on local authorities without spending cash in bribes. In return, he must meet deadlines that do not care about blizzards or fever in the animals. These autarch-like partnerships produce a class of traders who think about margins and goodwill with equal care, men who can discuss silk grades and horse fodder with equal authority. Their letters show a tone that is both deferential and assured, because they exist in the space between power and necessity and must speak to both. Under this protection, information about processes travels more smoothly than the things themselves. The techniques of papermaking move from one valley to another as artisans borrowed by a prince teach a second prince's men. Gunpowder recipes pass quietly in the packs of a man who carries no weapons because weapons are made in fixed places and require patronage, while formula only require a careful ear and a good memory. Textile patterns, mining practices, water wheel designs, these migrate in the mouths of craftsmen moving under orders, in the gestures of apprentices learning from strangers, in the chastened pride of masters who admit that someone else's way takes fewer strokes. You see the road being used less as a pipeline and more as a capillary bed in which small exchanges make tissues thrive. When you stand by a post at dusk and listen to the slight creaks as leather dries in the chill, you think about how much of this system is merely the amplification of what the Sogdians and their neighbors already knew. The difference is scale and certainty. Where earlier a caravan hoped for safety provided by custom, now it applies for safety provided by policy. Where earlier a courier might rely on a network of friends, now he relies on posts built and stocked for him. The world feels more centralized and thus paradoxically more personal, because the faces at the posts begin to repeat along routes, and you can measure your own life by how many of them you can name. And then you wonder, when safety and speed are guaranteed by authority, do people forget how to improvise? And if the posts go quiet one day, will the road remember how to keep itself open without them? You begin the next stretch not with a battlefield, but with a desk, because under the Mongol canopy, the permission to move is written before it is ridden. A clerk laying out reeds and ink prepares the papers that turn intentions into legalized motion. The document he produces is formulaic by design: the bearer's name, the purpose of travel, the number of pack animals, the expected route, the validity window, and the authority that guarantees compliance. It is stamped, dried, folded, and slipped into a pouch that will be shown and resealed many times. Alongside the paper, a metal tablet, a paser, serves as the harder face of the same permission. This pairing of soft and hard authority makes the road predictable in a way seasoned traders feel in their shoulders. The same man who once relied on bluff and charm now relies on clauses and seals, and while he may miss the freedom of improvisation, he does not miss the losses that improvisation often invited. In this administrative rhythm, the yam, the relay system, becomes the empire's pulse. You can step into a post house and find sameness comforting. Hooks on the wall for bridles, racks for bows, a bench rubbed silky by the weight of men waiting their turn, a ledger with the day's entries in a hand that varies in neatness by the scribe's patience. The stable yard is an economy in miniature, a boy with a currycomb working in circles, a woman pouring water into a trough with measured care to avoid waste, a smith kissing the iron's color to judge when to hammer. Outside, fodder is stored on platforms to keep it off damp ground, and farther out still, a belt of scrub is kept cut to deny cover to thieves. If you visit posts over months, you begin to understand the preferences of their masters. One is severe and precise, another is lenient and smiling, a third is efficient to the point of boredom. Yet all know their metrics. Horses sent out, horses returned, delayed couriers explained, supplies accounted for, until the next wagon arrives with grain and grease. The caravanserai punctuate the distances between posts like parentheses that hold the sentence of travel together. Each walled complex is both shelter and instrument. At the gate, a guard checks the count of animals against the manifest. At the courtyard's edge, a registrar copies names and goods into a book that can be perused by tax officials or by anyone with enough authority to suggest interest. Inside, trade resumes where the day's march paused. Saddles are unbuckled, sores are treated with ointments that smell of fat and herbs, and a cook sets a pot to work with onions, whose sweetness is a small mercy. Rooms are assigned according to habit and fee. Men familiar with one another cluster by choice, and those who are new arrive quietly, listening first, speaking later. There is a well. There are rules about its use. There are penalties for ignorance. All this keeps a fragile peace among strangers who must coexist long enough to sleep and to leave. The merchant's ledgers take on a new clarity under all this structure. Deals are written to be read by clerks who were not present when the words were first spoken. A bale's identity, weight, grade, origin, ownership, condition is written in a shorthand that reduces ambiguity. Contracts often include contingency lines: what happens if a pass is closed by snow, if a bridge is washed out, if a horse falls sick and cannot be replaced within 3 days at the standard rate. The contingency lines are annotated with fees and forfeits, turning misfortune into a schedule rather than a quarrel. You can imagine a merchant tracing his finger down one of these pages at dusk, lips moving silently as he checks that his risk is bounded by language, even as he knows that no language can cover the full sparseness of distance. Under the Mongols, paper itself becomes a kind of portable command. In certain regions, paper money circulates with the court's insistence giving it spine. A market day in a large town shows the friction of transition. Some sellers accept paper readily, others prefer coins or goods. Savvy caravans carry a mixture, and carry also the ability to arbitrage, to sell where paper is valued and buy where coin is preferred, to convert at terms that favor the man who understands which official stands behind which promise. There is a petty economy in the margins of such conversions. A scribe who writes receipts is tipped to write them clearly. A guard who helps move goods to a safer corner of the yard expects a cup of something warm. The system works because the petty economies do not contradict the larger one. They grease it. The great partnership arrangements, the autok arrangements, formalize risk-sharing between elite and trader. You can picture the conversation in a room that attempts dignity with carpets and cushions. A patron whose interest is both profit and reach offers capital and a letter of protection. A merchant offers expertise and endurance. The patron asks about routes, about timing, about the most fragile parts of the plan. The merchant asks about what happens when a patron's protection collides with a local official's pride. Out of this comes a written agreement that looks bland to outsiders but is alive to those who have carried loads over deserts. Shares are assigned, milestones are set. The patron takes a cut on goods only he can protect. The merchant takes a cut on goods only he can sell. The letter of protection is copied twice and sealed. The merchant tucks one copy in a pouch he sleeps on. While the main roads thrum with this managed movement, side roads benefit too, catching overflow and feeding into the trunk lines. Small caravanserai, less grand and more flexible, line these feeders. They are run by families who inherit not buildings but habits. How to price in seasons when traffic is thin, how to recognize counterfeit permissions, how to ensure that animals are not mistreated in ways that will anger postmasters downstream. The owners of these places keep peaceful relations with nearby villagers by buying hay at fair prices and by stepping in when disputes threaten to draw in travelers who cannot afford entanglement. When a dispute arises, a senior voice speaks in a calm tone that is not a performance. It is a skill born of preventing small fires from finding fuel. Couriers pass through it all like the empire's breath. They bring orders, news of prices, notices of appointments and removals, warnings of disease. A good courier is spare, pragmatic, and silent by temperament. He sleeps when he can, eats what is put before him, avoids the temptation to linger in a warm room for the extra cup that drags on a schedule. He knows how to read weather, not for romance, but for what it will do to hooves and shoes, to straps and roofs. When he changes horses, he checks the animal's eyes and chest with a brief touch, because an animal that looks good can hide a cough that becomes a crisis at the next rise. He keeps a small kit for repairing straps and for binding. His own hands where reins wear skin. He keeps an even smaller kit for sealing his messages again if curiosity becomes too strong. And he does a thing he knows he should not. Across the empire's tissues, knowledge moves as predictably as goods. The techniques of making, fixing, and counting travel by appointment and by osmosis. A miller learns a new gear angle from a man who came to buy flour and stayed long enough to talk in gestures and chalk. A physician compares notes with a monk who has seen bowel sickness in 3 different valleys and has kept track of which preparations soothe and which do not. A woman who runs a kitchen in a caravanserai learns to dry meat in a way that keeps better in humidity because a traveller from the coast described it idly while waiting for his companions. None of these transfers will be listed in a ledger, and yet they compound in a way that makes the road feel wider than its physical width. Even at the empire's height, friction remains. A local official resents the ease with which a merchant can bypass his leverage by presenting a letter from a higher authority. A post depleted by a run of traffic asks for resupply that arrives a week late, and in that gap, tempers rise. A town on a side route raises fees because a local harvest failed, and its people are hungry, and the ripple pushes caravans onto neighboring routes where wells are fewer. These frictions are recorded and reconciled through the same paperwork that they strain. A complaint is written, carried, noted, and sometimes answers arrive. The miracle is not that frictions exist, but that so many are managed without cascading into closure. At night, the quiet detail of the system emerges at the edges of lamplight. A caravan leader, cardigan pulled close against a draft, lays out his next 7 days in a simple grid: distances, known posts, likely inns, stretches where wind is cruel, places where prices are fair. He assigns an extra animal to a man who tires easily because it will cost less than a delay. He moves a nervous guard to a spot where his anxiety does less harm. He tucks one bale among the least tempting goods because he suspects a search somewhere ahead and wants the inspection to waste itself on something obvious. He writes a short letter to a partner 2 weeks behind, offering 3 facts and 1 judgment. He seals it with a smear of wax and sleeps because the system only helps those who arrive in time to ask it to. From within this architecture, the question arises that is both practical and philosophical. Does an order like this, so reliant on documents, posts, and fixed expectations, create an overconfidence in the permanence of those supports? And if a season comes when the relays falter and permissions fail, will those who learn to trust paper remember how to survive on improvisation, or will the road's discipline have trained them out of the very adaptability that once made the Silk Roads possible? You notice the first cracks not as noise but as silence. A post that was always busy sits oddly quiet. A pass that was predictably cleared by a certain date remains closed, with a shrug that no one thought to rehearse an explanation for. At a caravanserai, a notice is posted saying that fodder allocations have been reduced, and that travelers are urged to bring more of their own. The word urged here does not disguise the truth that those who do not will become burdens on the very system they take for granted. In the ledger of a merchant's memory, these are yellow flags that suggest caution. Then come the red ones. A letter arrives late and carries old news. Rumors of sickness in a coastal port reach the interior and move faster than the sickness itself, altering routes as men choose uncertainty in the north over fear in the south. The yam, though designed with redundancy, suffers from the same human limits as any network. Fewer posts are fully provisioned, more masters defer maintenance, the chain still works but more of its links clatter. On the grand scale, fragmentation creeps from the edges toward the center. The political unity that kept local ambitions dampened begins to fray. One governor tests a new tax on passing goods and finds that no reprimand arrives. A commander in charge of a stretch of road diverts supplies to solve a local deficit, and the post downstream must suddenly improvise with less. Caravan leaders compare notes at inns and hear the same refrain in different accents. Plan for delays, carry more grain, accept that letters will be read more suspiciously by officials who now trust only the orders they issued themselves. The architecture of trust that made speed a function of good behavior rather than charm begins to wobble where habit relied too heavily on the assumption of enforcement. Sickness travels too, informs the road cannot negotiate. A pestilence rides with fleas and breath and fear, and the structures that kept men and animals moving begin to operate as efficient distributors of harm. A caravan arrives with 2 men, coughing. 3 days later, the inn's cook is ill. A week later, the guard who insisted on counting the animals twice cannot stand. The register books, so proud of their neat entries, become inadvertent maps of exposure, names, dates, places, a grim itinerary. In response, towns shut gates more often and for longer. Caravans camp outside walls and trade through lines and gestures. Prices lurch, not gently. A lector at a monastery who once prided himself on recording donors' names now writes their deaths with a hand that does not try to be even. Under such conditions, the processes of the road do not stop entirely, but they change their purpose, from making distance cheap to making it survivable. Even where pestilence does not directly strike, the economic shock transmits quickly. Goods pile up at warehouses as buyers vanish or retreat into caution. Credit tightens because promises are hardest to honor when tomorrow becomes a guess. Partnerships fray under arguments about force majeure. What counts as an excuse and what counts as failure? Under the tense lamplight, men who built their lives on honoring notes find themselves unable to do so in terms that give them dignity. Some arrangements are salvaged by grace, others harden into resentment. In the aftermath, a leaner commerce resumes with smaller caravans, wary plans, and a taste for flexibility over speed. The posts that survive do so because someone cared, enough to keep them supplied even when returns were uncertain. The empire's descent into regional polities, west here, east there, changes the nature of paperwork. Travelers now carry bundles of papers, not just one, each with seals, each with conditions that may contradict the next. A merchant needs to know which to show first at a gate to avoid inciting jealousy from the authority not listed on the top page. He learns to read a guard's face for allegiance as readily as he reads the weather for dust. The Paisa retains some power in pockets, but its universal fluency diminishes. Letters of credit devolve to letters between individuals whose names carry currency within narrower circles. The language of the road becomes more intimate again, less imperial, more like the Sogdian world of overlapping networks that predates the archipelago of posts. What persists is the technique of movement. Caravans shrink without losing the routines that keep them resilient, evening checks of straps, the rotation of watch in the coldest hours, the habit of moving quietly past a camp where men have gathered in a way that suggests hunger rather than celebration. The caravanserai that close or fall into disrepair are replaced by smaller inns with lower walls and stronger ties to the settlements that feed them. Wells still need cleaning, fords still need shoring, shelters still need roofs sealed against the sharp rains that surprise in a few places each year. You see that the road's muscle memory outlasts its nerve, and in that there is comfort. A system that learned to go fast can relearn to go steadily. New powers rise or reassert, princes who build their legitimacy by promising old virtues with new names: safety, order, fair levies. Some deliver, at least for a time, and travellers respond by adding their routes to new maps. Others declare and fail, and the routes adjust away. Meanwhile, alternative paths strengthen. Maritime routes, always present, grow in reliability. Ports learn to be caravan, serai of water with their own versions of posts, papers, and protections. Overland does not die, but it shifts to what it can carry best. Goods of high value and small volume. Information that cannot wait for a ship's schedule. Animals whose trade requires land by definition. The road's voice becomes softer in the world's conversation, but it keeps speaking in markets where men prefer talking face to face before they trust. In the places where the yam once ran like a bright line, the remnants become incorporated into local lives. A former post becomes a village's barn. The post's fodder platforms become stages for festivals. The ledgers sit in trunks and are consulted only when a land dispute needs a precedent. A traveller from a later century will see only ordinary buildings and not know what they were. But if you stand long enough in the courtyard that used to hold horses in urgent rotation, you can almost hear the hollow thud of hooves, the curt exchange of papers, the clipped thanks, the fading rhythm into distance. The space remembers even when the people have forgotten. If the Pax Mongolica taught the road how to trust paper and policy, its end taught the road how to trust people again. A guard, who once waved a traveller through because a seal commanded him to do so, now waves him through because he owes him a favour from a lean year. A shopkeeper, who once accepted paper because an official insisted he must now accept coin because hunger leaves little room for obedience to abstract promises. From a certain angle, this looks like decline, and in a way it is. From another angle, it is adaptation, and in that the road shows the same stubbornness it always has. It remains in the hands of those who walk it, feed it, water it, and sleep beside it. So you end this passage where every traveller eventually stands, at a junction where one route looks faster and the other safer, where your papers may or may not still mean what they meant last season, and where you must decide whether to trust the memory of speed or the practice of steadiness. And you ask yourself, as the animals shift their weight and the morning cool begins to lift, when a world remembers how to slow down after a season of enforced speed, which skills does it keep, which does it quietly let go, and how does it decide which ones to teach to those who will ride after you? To understand the late Silk roads, you stand first in a port and listen to the sea count time differently from the desert. The monsoon has its own calendar, felt in the way sails fill and deflate with the season's breath. A harbour master marks the turning points not with festivals, but with wind charts, and his desk is crowded with lists that look like those in a caravanserai office. Vessel names, cargo types, weights, crew counts, fees owed, expected departures. News of wind shifts travels like news of pass openings inland. Merchants who once timed a caravan to a winter crossing now time shipments to a fair wind in late spring. You see the continuity, distance calculated not by romance but by routine. The docks are noisy with creaks and calls, but the same orderliness you saw at land inns holds here. Rope coiled neatly to avoid delays, sacks stacked by origin and destination, scales kept near and checked often. Behind the port, the city's warehouses are another kind of oasis. They are dry, dark, and numbered. Each bay has a chalked list of what is inside, when it arrived, when it is due to move, and who paid for the space. Interest in time again shapes behavior. If a shipment is delayed, fees accumulate. If it leaves early, discounts may apply. Men with the tolerance for extended calculation make money not only on goods but on timing. The cash box holds coin from many mints, each needing its own arithmetic. There is the quiet business of exchange, the murmur of rates, the stories told, about a coin's trustworthiness that are as emotional as they are technical. In these rooms you learn again that the road, now the sea-laced road, depends on the steady resilience of people who tally and shoulder and wait. Far inland, the old corridors continue in a slower but still careful rhythm. Caravans carry horses, furs, felt, tea, silk, and the kinds of goods whose value to weight makes land sensible. They move not to replace the ships, but to feed them and skim off what ships cannot take or cannot take easily at a profit. The crossing points between sea and land, places where a caravan meets a harbour, create hybrid infrastructures. Pack animals step onto wharves where they snort at the smell of brine and fish, and a porter, accustomed to balancing bales on his back, experiments with slings that lift to a ship's deck. Counting changes scale but not type. A bale is still a unit. A jar is still a risk if it is stacked poorly. A horse is still a living asset that requires pause and feed. The technology shifts, lateen sails and stitched hulls, stern post rudders and compasses supplementing stars, but the habits that move goods remain human. Wake up earlier than comfort would dictate, do the boring work before the interesting. Work! Check again what you just checked. Along the coasts and in straits, officials learn to be both gate and guide. A customs clerk holds a ruler in one hand and a pen in the other. The ruler measures, the pen records, and the function in both cases is revenue. He is paid too little and sees too much, and his honesty is kept in place by a mixture of supervision, routine, and a sense that he is as integral to the city's health as the dock workers who haul ropes. Ships receive passes that authorize passage along certain coasts and entry to certain ports. Caravans receive similar letters for the road out of town. The passes mention tolls and guarantee safety in words that are more or less honored depending on the year. Men learn quickly which oaths invoke a real promise and which are printed courtesy. In the overland towns where the late silk roads continue to matter, you find the waterworks intact and the markets reflective. The irrigation overseer's staff is still notched. The canal is still patched where it erodes. Farmers, aware of markets beyond their town, plant a little extra of what travels well: dried fruits, wool, durable grain. Temples, mosques, and monasteries continue to serve as resting places for travelers, and their guest books list men from farther away than you might expect in a season when ships carry so much. A trader explains his choices with a shrug. Some goods are secretive by nature and prefer the privacy of land. Others are too fragile to trust to rough seas. Still others belong to relationships formed generations ago and will continue that way until someone breaks trust by trying to become too efficient. On the sea, bulk goods dominate like never before. Spices and sugar move in quantities that make a caravan feel small. Timber and rice fill hulls and pour wealth onto quays in a scale that dazzles even an experienced mind. Yet along the same docks, small packages change hands with the gravity of treasure. A set of manuscripts gifts, a box of jewels, a bundle of rare medicines. These travel in the care of a single trusted person, their journey more like that of a caravan's bale than that of a ship's load. The trusted person keeps habits familiar to land traders, counting, checking seals, sleeping lightly, avoiding too much talk about what he carries. He understands that an empire of ships cannot eliminate the need for couriers, it simply changes their routes. The legal landscape accessorizes these routines with new terms. Trading communities negotiate privileges, reduced fees, guaranteed access to storage, adjudication in their own courts, by offering predictable revenue and by promising to resolve internal disputes without public disturbance. These arrangements are written in the polite language of treaties, but their enforcement happens in offices like those you have come to know: a clerk's desk, a ledger, a schedule of fees, a list of names. When disputes break through the membrane of community, they present as arguments over weights, purity of metals, and compliance with posted tariffs. A simple weight on a chain, swung from a hook, becomes the final court of appeal more often than a judge does, and men who live in its shadow become priests of balance. At the joints where sea and land cooperate, knowledge flows both ways. A sailor who has learned to read clouds teaches a caravan leader new ways to anticipate weather in a valley where the sky, too, telegraphs patterns if you know how to read its edges. A caravan leader teaches a ship's quartermaster how to pack fragile goods in a way that tolerates vibration without damage. A scribe who has written in land styles learns forms of maritime bills of lading, adding columns for ballast and deck cargo, entries for leakage and evaporation that would make no sense inland. These cross-instructions create a cadre of people whose competence looks the same whether they stand on deck or on dust. Meanwhile, inland travelers adjust to the realities created by maritime abundance. Prices for some goods fall when ships bring them in bulk, which changes land traders' portfolios. A caravan that once carried spices now concentrates on fabrics with particular patterns preferred far away, or on finely worked metal items protected by clever packing. A new specialization appears: the return goods merchant, who arranges for valuable land products to meet ships returning light so that a captain can profit on both legs. This merchant learns port schedules as intimately as a desert traveler knows wells. He avoids the risks of deep desert but embraces the risks of timing. His profit is in being right about when wind and contract will intersect. At night in a port, under lamps swinging with a gentler breeze, you recognize the same small-sized humanity you know from caravan yards. Men count, argue, settle, and eat. They worry about tomorrow's weather and about whether a change in government will mean a reissuance of passes and a delay that will turn profit into break-even. Women run shops that stay open until the last boat is tied, selling food to those who will sleep on deck. They exchange news that will be stitched into decisions by morning. Children learn to coil rope neatly, to carry a ledger without smudging it, to distinguish coins by fingertip. The mechanics of rising, washing, working, and resting recur in a new setting without losing their essence. Standing in the middle of this composite system, you feel a continuity that outlives labels. Whether the day's load is lashed to a deck or to a saddle, the behaviors that sustain exchange are the same: respect for schedules, care for tools, generosity in small favors, firmness in contracts, a preference for boring dependability over brilliant gambles. The late Silk Roads are not a closed chapter. They are a slow redirection of streams that continue to water fields on both sides of the dunes. And you ask yourself, watching a camel blink at a ship's lantern as if regarding a fellow worker, when two forms of movement become partners rather than rivals, which skills become indispensable and which, without anyone deciding, slip quietly into museums of memory. If you focus now on the gates, the literal ones at city walls and the figurative ones at bureaucratic thresholds. You see how the late Silk roads flow through regulators as through sluices. At a major overland city's gate, guards weigh more than goods. They weigh intentions. They look at the way a caravan is strung out, at the alignment of packs, at the confidence in the leader's posture. Documents are presented in a sequence learned by those who pass often. First the general permit, then the tally of goods, then any letters of safe conduct, and only last any letters implying privilege. Presenting privilege first tempts resentment. Presenting it last allows the clerk to feel he has done his duty before he yields to a higher seal. Fees are posted, and a separate document explains exemptions for religious institutions, critical supplies, or certain diplomatic missions. The steep posting of such rules legible and public reduces arguments. It does not eliminate them. Inside the gate stands a weigh station, a platform, a beam scale, and a man whose reputation is made by how rarely his weights are found wanting. Traders insist on seeing the official weights, dark with use, kept in a chest that is opened with gravity. The weigher's assistant moves steadily, adjusting the beam with the fewest possible motions. Fractions are resolved not with decimals, but with additional small weights. Practice makes the movement neat. Each weighing is recorded with a mark that later becomes a number in a ledger somewhere else, and a tax is assessed not as a single confiscation, but as a thin shaving applied consistently. The thinness is the point. A system that takes a little often survives longer than one that shocks. On the maritime side, harbour dues are collected with similar choreography. A ship's master reports tonnage, crew, and cargo according to categories that have been argued into existence over decades. The categories, more than the physical goods, determine the fee. This is politics disguised as accountancy. A fee reduction for grain in a famine, an extra levy on luxury imports when a ruler wants to display moral seriousness, a favourable rate. For timber when a building campaign is underway, all these choices show up as columns in a table that a clerk replicates until memory makes the pen move by habit. Inspectors climb aboard and look with eyes sharpened by years. They glance at the seams to judge age, at the stowage to judge competence, at the crew's shoes to judge how far they have come. Official gatekeepers control not only entry, but time. They authorize how long a caravan may remain in the city before. Moving on to prevent markets from clogging with speculative hoarding, they assign berths to ships not merely by arrival order, but by cargo, urgency, and politics. Favor is a form of currency, and the wise trader knows how to earn it without appearing to buy it. Donations to a shrine whose keeper is respected by the guards can do more than a reckless bribe. Hiring locals as porters not only buys goodwill, but provides eyes and ears inside the apparatus. These techniques are not secrets. They are the craft of moving through with as little friction as possible. Meanwhile, the inland infrastructure is maintained by institutions whose names change but whose functions do not. Caravanserai in regions under new rulers receive repairs and fresh paint, and an official writes a report taking credit for what a cadre of labourers actually did in a week of hot work. Wells are cleaned on a schedule, posted in a script, commonly enough to be read by those who need to read it. Bridges are assessed after spring floods and patched with timbers, lashed and pinned according to local custom. You would not call these works glorious, but you would notice their absence quickly. The men in charge of these structures brag the way any craftsperson does, not in speeches, but in the smoothness of surfaces, the straightness of lines, and the absence of complaints. At the frontiers where polities are but, arrangements are made to manage overlap. Joint posts share information about fugitives and counterfeit documents. They synchronize market days to avoid chaos. They accept each other's weights with minimal quibble. These are achievements of pen and patience, not of force. A trader moving through such zones keeps multiple copies of everything, each addressed to a different official title, each written in a respectful tone whose formula is tuned to local taste. He also keeps a separate bundle for the unanticipated, a letter of introduction from a religious leader, a gift tied in neutral cloth, a promise written vaguely enough to be welcomed by many and refused by none. City quarters where trading communities concentrate preserve habits that make administration's work easier. Registers kept by community heads provide authorities with head counts and tax bases that save time. Disputes are managed internally where possible, with careful notes in ledgers that may one day be opened to settle an argument over whether someone paid his share of a communal levy. Funerals are arranged quietly when politics is tense. Weddings are held near, but not at main thoroughfares to avoid the impression of ostentation. You see here the survival skill most consistent across centuries, the ability to read the mood of a place and to adjust visibility accordingly. Tariff schedules become the scriptures of exchange. Traders memorize the rates that matter to them. So much for a horse, so much per weight of silk of a certain grade, a different amount for worked metal versus ingots, another schedule still for dyes and medicines. Scribes casually handle numbers that would earn them a bookkeeper's title elsewhere. When rates change, the news spreads in hours, not days. A coffee seller hears it from a guard, who heard it from an inspector, who saw the new sheet being posted. The seller tells a spice trader, who alters his bundles accordingly. A caravan 2 days out receives a message and chooses the northern gate, where the rates implementation lags behind the posting. The long-distance credit that oil these gates chooses careful paths. A letter of credit payable at a port must name a trustworthy paymaster. A bill drawn inland must confirm identity with signals that petty officials can understand. Seals are compared by feel as well as sight, because counterfeits often fail the finger before they fail the eye. Witnesses stand by unconcerned about their role, because standing by is a lifetime habit on these roads. They may be called upon later to confirm that the man who signed was the man whose name is written, and their memory, which holds thousands of faces, will be relied on more than they might like. In all this passing through, ordinary kindness stabilizes, flows as much as law. A guard warns a caravan leader about an inspection tomorrow that will be stricter than usual. A harbor pilot steers a vessel a shade further from a shoal than the chart demands, because he remembers a storm 2 winters ago that shifted sand. A clerk, asked to stay late to finalize a permit, grumbles and then stays because he knows that tomorrow's arrival schedule will be worse. These favors accumulate interest in a social bank that bridges bad times. When a gate closes early during unrest, the men who did these favors will be remembered by those who can make a difference. You step back and see gates not as obstacles, but as places where the road articulates itself into manageable pieces. The difference between a closed world and an open one is not the absence of gates, it is the integrity with which they are operated. The late Silk Roads navigate through such integrity at many scales, sustained as much by personalities as by policies. And you wonder, looking at a clerk who blows dust from a ledger before writing a name in a careful hand, when so much turns on the behavior of people in small offices, how does a trading world prepare for the day when the careful retiree and the careless arrive, and what routines can survive such substitutions without losing their quiet strength? By the time steam whistles echo near old caravan routes, you stand in a world that recalculates distance again. Railways lay iron lines where caravan trails once meandered, and the sound of hooves is joined by the clatter of wheels. Telegraph. Wires string across valleys and deserts, making news run faster than any courier could. Ports deepen and host larger hulls, and schedules become printed timetables that strangers can learn to trust. The late Silk Roads do not stop. They find themselves braided into these new systems with varying degrees of ease. Inland towns with rail stations become new caravanserai. Goods arrive by train and depart on camelback for the last leg, or the reverse. The arithmetic of cost shifts again. A bale that once took weeks now takes days. A letter that once took days now takes hours. The habits learned over centuries are not discarded. A trader who steps onto a platform with a clipboard instead of a tally board checks his freight with the same practiced suspicion, rejects a damaged crate with the same calm insistence, and greets the station master with the same mixture of respect and quiet claim to priority he used at a gate. Contracts now mention delivery times in hours, but they still include clauses for acts of God and for human error. Insurance, once a matter of trust and goodwill, becomes a profession with forms and premia, but the core remains: transfer risk to those who can afford to absorb it. The same people who once guided caravans now guide wagons to depots. They still know which shaded corner keeps a crate cooler and which open spot dries a tarp faster after rain. Along the old routes, water still needs managing. Canats and canals are not made obsolete by engines. They keep fields alive and towns fed. A new bureaucracy arrives to measure and distribute water using forms and stamps that look suspiciously like the ones used for trade, because controlling a flow of water or goods requires similar care. The men who once counted bales now count buckets. The skills are transferable. The quiet expertise of measuring, scheduling, adjudicating small disputes fairly, these remain the difference between a place that thrives and a place that leaks its people to cities where machines hum. Some caravanserai become inns for rail travellers. Others become storage. A few fall, their bricks scavenged for new walls. Yet the mental architecture remains so legible that you can feel it when you enter a modern warehouse with numbered bays and a central desk. The echoes, posts, schedules, permits, seals are unmistakable. Even the words carry across centuries: consignment, manifest, bill of lading, delivery receipt. The technologies change, the grammatical structure of movement does not. A container ship is an argument for standardization. That would make a late medieval clerk smile. Everything measured, counted, stacked, sealed, tracked. As states consolidate and borders harden, the old agreements that once allowed traders to rely on community governance become subsumed into national laws. Some protections improve, some flexibilities vanish. Communities that once handled their own disputes must now hire lawyers to translate custom into statute. The trader's day includes more time at desks and less in markets. Yet talk to anyone who does this work and you find the same preferences as before: clarity over surprise, posted rates over haggled whims, an inspector who does his job over a bribe taker who could turn any favor into a trap. Maritime dominance becomes more pronounced, but land finds niches. Bulk moves by ship. Urgency moves by rail and road. Horses no longer define warfare, but animals still define certain industries. Tea and wool still like dry places to travel. Fragile antiques still prefer careful hands. The romance of the caravan becomes a story told to visitors. Yet if you stand at a truck stop in a high pass and listen to drivers discuss snow chains and fuel schedules, you will hear familiar cadences. The vocabulary shifts. The psychology remains. People who move things at a profit are conservative about routines and inventive about contingencies. The memory of how to move is preserved in families and in institutions. A daughter who grew up listening to her grandmother describe how to pack porcelain learns how to strap laptops so they do not vibrate to death in a long haul over gravel. A son who watched his father negotiate a fair price with a weigher learns how to push back respectfully against a digital scale that claims a number at odds with the paperwork. The social bank of favors never closes. A call to a clerk who remembers your honesty can still hurry a permit along. A tip to a loader who sees you often still buys careful handling. The difference is that now the clerks and loaders wear uniforms and clock in on time. The sameness is that they are still people making judgment calls. In places where the late silk roads once hummed, museums gather evidence into rooms: a seal, a ledger, a length of cloth, a brass weight, a pizer behind glass. School children pass by, and a guide speaks about long-distance trade in tones that mix pride and nostalgia. Outside, a market sells plastic buckets and mobile phone cases and bread, and the bread tastes like bread tasted when a caravan arrived hungry, and the cases hold devices that bring news like the old couriers did. The continuity is not a trick. It is a pattern in which material and habit knit more closely than one might guess from the difference in tools. If you walk away from the museum and into a quiet quarter at dusk, you might pass a courtyard where someone counts. Not bales now, but deliveries for the morning, not camels, but trucks, not passes for gates, but QR codes for a scanner. The posture, the focus, the little murmurs of numbers under the breath, these would have looked right at home beside a lamp in a caravanserai. The world has not stopped being a place where distance is tamed by agreement and routine. It has merely redrawn the corridors along which men and women practice these agreements and routines. Standing one last time on a line where sand meets water, you hear both kinds of movement. A wave hisses across shingle, a wind blows grit against your boots. A container ship moves on a schedule that can be looked up. A truck climbs a switchback that can be felt in the stomach. The late silk roads did not vanish. They distributed themselves into these movements, their skills absorbed, their stories archived in behaviors more than in books. And as you breathe a little of salt and a little of dust, you might ask, when knowledge that once had the dignity of a named road becomes the common sense of ports and warehouses everywhere, how do we keep sight of the people who built that knowledge one careful, boring, necessary gesture at a time?